Welcome to the Painting Onions podcast. I'm your host Lorenz. I'm a psychologist and I interview leading scientists from different fields to get multi-level perspectives on how humans work. Today's guest is John Cryan. He's one of the leading scientists in the field of the microbiome and its effects on the brain and our physical and mental health. And we will be talking about what the microbiome is, how you can affect your microbiome, and with what kinds of physical and mental health issues it's connected. And so please like this video if you liked it in the end, and subscribe to the channel, because then I'll be encouraged and it will be more likely that I will reach out to many more leading scientists who will then come to the podcast. So have fun. Okay, John Cryan, welcome to the Painting Onions podcast. Thank you so much for taking your time.
My pleasure, Lawrence. My pleasure.
So I would like to start with the basics. What is the microbiome and what is the microbiota gut-brain axis?
Yeah, the microbiome is a catch-all term for the collection of bacteria, viruses, fungi, these microorganisms. We have trillions of them within and on us. And they are really important aspects of all of our physiology. The gut-brain axis then is basically how our gut talks to our brain. And this is really important for various aspects of homeostasis. And then we've learned in the last probably 2 decades or so that actually the microbes in the gut play a key role in regulating how the gut talks to the brain. So that's what the microbiome gut-brain axis is.
Mm-hmm. So it's a two-way street, right? So the brain influences the gut and the microbiome and the other way around, right?
Yes, it definitely is a two-way street, although a lot of the research focus has been on going from the microbes to the brain. There has been less, although it's really open for more research, looking at how brain and affects the gut microbes. We've been interested in more in the context of stress, and particularly psychological stress, and how that's affecting the microbes.
Okay. And I mean, the main reason why we talk about this is the microbiome is connected to all kinds of physical and mental health issues. Could you maybe list some of these?
So we need to think of the microbes also from an evolutionary perspective, because it's really important to say that the microbes were there first. So our bodies have evolved with these microbes, and we in our modern world, we compartmentalize the body, and we don't often think about it as a integrative evolutionary aspect. And so it's one of these key things that if we view, it's been said that if you viewed the world as in time, in terms of a year, that the microbes evolved, came around sometime in March, and the humans evolved on New Year's Eve. And so, this is really a microbial world. And so with that in mind, then, we start to really appreciate that for a lot of normal, healthy processes, the microbes are kind of our friends with benefits. And this ranges from, breaking down the sugars in breast milk that gives key nutrition to the infant, to harvesting or providing key vitamins and various other things. So then when you start looking at disturbances in the microbiome or things that go wrong in it, and then how that could be linked to disease, it's complex. So we try and simplify it as much as we can, but it is very complex. But there are almost all diseases now have been in some way implicated to have some level of role of a disturbed microbiome in either their ontogeny, their natural history, or their treatment. For example, like one of the big surprising things to your listeners will be that the efficacy of some of the really modern drugs in cancer, how they work, is dependent on the composition of your microbes. If you have certain microbes and you're getting treatment for melanoma, that could depend that could really influence whether you're going to respond or not. Whether you become obese or whether you have diabetes, whether you have a flare-up in inflammatory bowel disease. It's been linked from, in terms of brain disorders, it's been linked to depression, to anxiety, to social disturbances. There are some links to autism, but we need a lot of caution in that field. And also to neurodegenerative diseases in relation to Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and motor neuron disease.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So this begs the question, how can we positively influence the microbiome in order to mediate those effects to the physical and or mental health aspects?
So that's a great question. And it's one where, it's still relatively early days to know what we can do. So there are different strategies to promote a healthy microbiome in general. And some of these are things that your listeners can implement in their everyday lives. Others can be a little bit more tricky. So let's talk about things that the strategies that are most often talked about. So let's talk about prebiotics and probiotics, okay? So probiotics are live bacteria when taken in adequate amounts confer a health benefit. The last part there is the tricky part, confers a health benefit. So how do you know if something confers a health benefit? Well, you have to do a placebo-controlled clinical trial. And for most of what's called a probiotic in the shelves, really hasn't been tested for health benefits at all. So we need a little bit of caution when you see probiotic. I often, but that's what they are. You'll see them. They're generally bifidobacteria or lactobacilli strains, and they're known to be good bacteria, and they're good. That's one strategy. My advice to anyone is be careful when you're buying them and look for, is there science to back up this claim?
Are you talking about pills or talking about like real food containing those?
So in this case, I'm largely talking probiotics are largely what we think about as available in health food stores and pharmacies in general. They usually come in pills or sachets or in some form within a matrix, a food matrix of some sort. So that's probiotics. Prebiotics again can come in an artificial form, like in your whole, but they also are what we can get from our diet. And prebiotics are basically the fertilizer to cause your bacteria good bacteria to bloom. And so they really are the energy, and they're generally fibers and sugars in particular. And so they are often coming from plants and whole grains and various things like that. So they're really good for your bacteria. Fibers, so diet is probably the best way to target your microbes. We know that one of the things that happens as we age is that we lose diversity of our microbiome. And like in all aspects of life, diversity is really key and important in your microbes too. And so one of the studies that came out from my colleagues here in Cork some years ago, called ElderMet, they showed that people who had a diverse diet, mainly containing colorful foods and vegetables, that it led to a more diverse microbiome and a better health outcome. So especially that's one of the things we want to increase diversity in foods. Fiber, well, fiber is kind of king. And we need to understand the benefits of fiber. We in the Western world do not eat enough fiber in our daily diet, and that's really important. And fiber comes in many forms, and there's different types of fibers, and some are work better in certain microbes or not, and that's really important. And then fermented foods. So to the German audience, this is easy. To Irish audience, this is tricky. We don't have a culture of fermented foods, but in Germany you do. And so fermented foods are really good for your microbiome. And so that's one of the things we've recently completed a study in healthy people, but they're stress sensitive and they have bad diets. our student population, if you would like. But we, just in 1 month, we changed people's diets and put them on a diet high in fiber and high in fermented foods. We really ramped up the fiber and really got them to really try more fermented foods. Fermented foods here generally are kefir, kombucha, kimchi, sauerkraut and everything else as well will work. But it really allows us to see if we change their diet and by targeting the microbiome, could we have a beneficial health outcome? And we could. In 1 month, their stress levels, their psychological way of sensing the stressful world, and some of their mood scores, these were all healthy people. They didn't have any clinical diagnosis, but it was, for me, really inspirational that just 1 month of targeting your microbiome could make you feel better. So it also offers a huge opportunity. We're now going to expand that to longer periods and look at the individual components. Is it the fiber? Is it the fermented food? Or is it both?
Interesting. And yeah, it's good to know that those normal people benefited as well, because, and I mean, in clinical psychology, and the notion of dimensions is being more and more popular too. So it's not either you have a mental disorder or you haven't, and you can have depressive or anxiety symptoms, for example, or stress symptoms, and they can be more or less. And then it's great that even if it's just in the middle range, for example, you can still get better. So that's cool. I heard you say that also, like, breastfeeding and C-section are good strategies for a healthy microbiome. Could you comment on that?
So yes and no. Yes, breastfeeding, no C-section.
No, sorry. Yeah.
During early life, basically, the main mode of nutrition that has evolved for infants and mammals in general is through breastfeeding. And basically, as I was alluding to, that we've handed over some of the work on breaking down the sugars in breast milk, the human milk oligosaccharides. We've handed over some of that work to the microbes. And so they can break it down into key chemicals like sialic acid. And sialic acid is really a good building block for brain development. So if you don't have access to these to these human milk oligosaccharides, you don't get much of this. And so there's growing data to support that this might give rise to some of the subtle but significant increases in IQ that we see in population studies comparing breastfeeding with bottle feeding. With regard to mode of delivery at birth, one of the main things that we notice is that microbes we're largely thought to be sterile in utero, and we get our microbes as a kind of a birthday present from our mums as we come through the birth canal. And these early frontier bacteria help to colonize the infant's gut and start to trigger its immune system and to really boost the immune system. Now, if you're born by C-section, what happens is it's like in the evolutionary relay race of life from mother to infant, the baton now gets dropped. And so you don't get handed over these really good microbes. You get handed over microbes from the hospital environment or from the skin, and they're different. And it's not only what the microbes you're missing, but also the microbes that are blooming in addition. And that can, that can affect host. And so we know from epidemiology studies that people born by C-section have an increased relative risk. We have to be very careful on this word, relative risk of asthma, allergy, type 1 diabetes. We know very little about it in the context of brain health, and that's something we've been studying. So we've been working on this in mouse models, and we've shown that there are enduring effects in the programming of the stress response. These animals are more stress sensitive, they're more anxious, and they have some subtle but significant social deficits. And then we did a study just published where we took a group of, well, I was going to say normal Irish medical students, and we stratified them based on their mode of delivery at birth. And we found that those that had been born by C-section had an enhanced psychological and biological response to an acute stressor. And we have really good ethical ways to stress people. One is called the Trier social stress test, founded in Trier in Germany. And it's basically if someone goes in and does a public speaking test in front of very grumpy looking people. And we're measuring all of this all the time. And it was really interesting because those born by C-section had this exaggerated immune and psychological profile. But that's acute stress. So the next question was, well, what about chronic stress? Because that's what we're really interested in terms of psychopathology. And so how can we ethically chronically stress individuals? And this is pre-pandemic overall. So what we did was, as every good educator does, is we subject our students to exams. And we look at how they respond to the examination period. And what we found was, yet again, those born by C-section had a subtle but significant elevation in the response to chronic stress at a biological and a psychological profile. Indeed, their Cohen's perceived stress scale was greatly elevated over the exam period. So that's really intriguing, telling us that, based on our animal studies, we can say that early life microbial disturbances by changing the mode of delivery can have long-lasting effects on brain and behavior. And then we have some evidence from human studies, although there's lots of confounds and limitations to such a cross-sectional study, but it's backed up by our animal studies. So the next question then is, can we do anything about this? And in our animal studies, we were able to reverse the phenotype by putting back in microbes, particularly bifidobacteria, and by doing prebiotics that stimulate bifidobacteria. In a separate study where we didn't take into account mode of delivery, but where we looked at how students responded to examination stress, we also showed that by giving a specific bifidobacterium longum, that it enhanced it basically reversed the impact of this chronic stress on their sleep patterns. We got sleep disturbances in controls, and those that had taken this probiotic, they had a better sleep quality during the stressful examination period. So there is things we can do, and there is opportunities to change this through targeting the microbiome. But all of this really tells us is that in early life, there's critical windows for when our microbes are really important to us. And so we have to understand the factors that are at play. And for example, I know colleagues in Ulm in Germany are working on where people grow up, whether they grow up in the countryside or in the city, and how that programs their ability to respond to later life stress, etc. And that's something that's really could be very much linked to the microbiomes they get and their exposures in early life. So we're beginning to build this framework of an environmental lifestyle approach to understanding how our microbes are having long-term effects on all aspects of our physiology, our brain, and our behavior.
Yeah, interesting. What about the maybe the worst things you could do? I mean, often it's probably just the opposite, eating unhealthy and not diverse, but yeah.
There are certain things we know. We have clear evidence that are. I mean, the opposite, yes. I mean, like you can just say, but we also have to be careful. Like, when I talk about C-section, C-section is a life-saving intervention and widely used. And I don't want to be a male here talking about women's obstetric choices in any shape or form that comes across judgmental. But what we do need is to support people to understand that there might be some, and it's all about relative risk factors overall. We need to support breastfeeding as much as possible in society, and that's really critical in my part of the world, where we have some of the worst rates of breastfeeding in Europe, and so it really needs to be put into a public health aspect. There are other things we can avoid. We can avoid processed food. Sorry for the Germans, it's really not good thing to talk about, I know, but a lot of processed food has been shown to be quite bad for the microbiome. Emulsifiers, sweeteners in particular that are present in a lot of processed food are quite bad. We know that stress is bad for your microbiome, so try and avoid that as much as possible. We know that certain pollutants and certain environmental hazards are bad for one's microbiome. And so, and then eating diet that's not very diverse, that's quite plain. You often see this in these nursing homes where everything is very beige. Like a lot of the factors in diet, whether it's polyphenols that give us color, or polyunsaturated fatty acids that are present in fish, they're really good for our microbiome. So we need to increase the intake of that. And then perhaps one of the last things to mention about that, that's been shown to positively affect the microbiome has been having a pet, particularly a dog. That's been shown to be a good thing. So your listeners might be interested in that.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I don't have a dog, but maybe at some point. Okay, I was also wondering about gut decisions. So to go with your gut, is it also influenced by the microbiome? And if so, would a healthier microbiome make for better decisions, better gut decisions, or?
Brilliant question. And it's something that we're really excited about trying to do some work in this. So I'm collaborating with a colleague in Berlin, in Potsdam, So-Young Park, and with who's a behavioral decision making scientist, brain imaging. So it's early days. We don't have any data yet. We've put in a large grant to work on this, together with a behavioral economist at the University of Nice, who works on this from a decision making in terms of making real world financial decisions. And these are things that we need to really figure out. How much of our normal behavior is under the control of our microbes, and can we target it in certain ways? Could we get the Irish football team to make right decisions and do well? Could we make the people I work with be nicer to each other? Could we improve teamwork? Could we improve all aspects of decision making? Could we see in a social context how people will operate better? And can we, understand what's going on? And so I ask these rhetorically because everything is possible with the microbiome. We're really excited about the microbiome's role in reward processing and appetitive aspects as well. But we need data, and we need psychologists to come and work on the microbiome, because you can't leave it to all of these mouse model people like me who can't do everything. But it really is really important that we get to the crux of this. I'm very excited about the role of interoception, and there's been an increased emphasis on the role of interoception in a brain-body approach to understanding behavior. And so we need to really appreciate that the microbiome is there. It's there because it can really start pulling the strings, and understanding then the pathways as to how it communicates is a really big part of our research program.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask about interoception too, because I've also noticed or read that in the past years, interoception has become very important for understanding, especially internalizing psychopathology, but probably all kinds of psychopathology. And so, but as you said, it's still a long way to go probably, and a lot of research has to be done. But it's pretty interesting that this is actually going on, and also with the gut decisions. Okay, so I was also wondering about if you could define psychobiotic, and also if I was wondering the psychobiotic therapies, if there have been studies with people, with humans, and then also how big the effect sizes are, because it's great if there are significant effects and so on, but is it really like, for example, the study you talked about with the stress and the students, is it like really big effects is probably hard to get, but is it medium or is it small, or is it?
No, it's a great question. These are great questions. So, okay, I'll define a psychobiotic. Psychobiotic is basically a microbiota targeted therapy, like I talked about earlier, but that has mental health benefits. So that's basically, we originally had it as very defined as a bacteria, but it could be, it doesn't have to be a bacteria. It can be a prebiotic. It could be a combination of a pro and prebiotic together, which we call a synbiotic. It could be a fermented food. It could be a even a fecal transplant, dare I say. But they, psychobiotics, we wrote about it in our book, The Psychobiotic Revolution, which is really for everyday people to, oh, there you go. No, but that book was there as a kind of a companion piece to what Julie Enders had already done in terms of popularizing the gut. Now we wanted to popularize what was going on in terms of the microbes in the gut. And we're very excited about the approach, really to try and get people to think about what's going on and really to try and separate science fact from science fiction and really, understand where we are as of that, as of the time. And although the field has moved on, it hasn't moved on that far since we wrote it. A lot of the data we had initially was in animal models, and we were able to show that specific bacteria were able to have positive effects on brain and behavior in animal models, especially on stress-related behavior and cognitive behaviors. And then we went into healthy volunteers. And so one of our early studies, a simple study, 22 individuals, we gave them a specific bifidobacteria that we had shown positive in our animal studies. And we again brought them into the lab and we stressed them, this time using what's called the socially evaluated cold pressure test, where you're basically putting your arm in a ice bucket of water and there's someone there judging you, looking very stern and, seeing how you are. So you mount a physiological, but also a psychological stressful response. And we were doing brain EEG and we were doing touchscreen cognitive tasks and, a whole battery of different things. And we got a significant signal that there was a positive effect. It was small, but these were healthy people. So how, so that's the conundrum with it. Then we were really buoyed by the fact that Paul Enk's group in Tübingen, they were interested in using their brain imaging studies, looking at, targeting the microbiome in some way. And so they came over to us looking at, well, what could we do? And we recommended they use the same probiotic that we'd been working with, this bifidobacteria. And they put it through a very complex cognitive task in the scanner, where the person is in the scanner is starting to play a ball game in virtual reality with two other people. So it's called a cyber ball task. And basically you're passing a ball from one to the other and it's all going very nicely. And then all of a sudden the two people who are playing with you stop sharing with you and, basically you become ignored. And your brain doesn't like to be ignored. And the neurobiology of the cyberball task is very well worked out in terms of frontal activity and various other brain regions that are being recruited. And so, but if they'd taken this probiotic, they didn't mount a stress response. They were like, again, it's a small study, healthy volunteer study, but really replicated what we had overall. So that's kind of, interesting. We then, just for completeness, we then took a lactobacillus, which was our most active bacteria in our animal studies, and then we put it through a similar strategy that we had in our healthy volunteers, and it did absolutely nothing, like zero, absolutely nothing. So this, it means that we have to invest in these types of studies to understand. Now, there were healthy people. So maybe if we'd given it to people who are more anxious, we might have got something. And so the concern in the field is that there's lots of small studies, very small sample size. And yes, to answer your question, relatively small effect sizes. One meta-analysis that came out in the British BMJ Nutrition last year looked at, and it did what I tell people not to do, but anyway, it just collapsed all of the data in a meta-analysis for prebiotics and probiotics for anxiety and depression. And there was a signal there, even when you put everything together. So the reason I don't like the lumping is that you would never just go into a pharmacy and just take random drugs and ask them, do they affect depression or anxiety, without understanding that why they might and what's going on. So that, you know, that's kind of there's an ad hocness to it all. So what we need is large-scale studies, placebo-controlled, potentially in people that have high levels of anxiety or subclinical depression, or even, you know, in adjunctive aspects with depression. But we need something that's going to really, you know, test this and look at what is the beneficial effects. But the selection of the intervention is going to be really important. And that's quite tricky, because how do you get funding to do these studies? Who's going to synthesize the product for you? And how are you going to do all of this? So we need to be careful, but we need to advocate for more of these studies, and most of them will fail, just like most pharmaceuticals fail overall. So we need to be aware and what we're trying to understand is the ones that work and have a signal, why are they working? What is it about them? What's decorating these bacterial cell walls? How is it interacting with the immune system? How is it tinkering with the enteric nervous system? How is it looking at the vagus nerve? What are the metabolites it's producing? Are any of them getting across the blood-brain barrier? Are any of them getting to the brain circuits from the brainstem up to the cortex to influence higher decision-making? So like all of these questions are things that are, you know, what my research program is all about. And I'm very excited about it. But we need to ground it in a level of, you know, where we are today, and we're not there yet, but we're getting there.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, even if if it turns out to be all just small effects, it's still great. And especially, I think, because the microbiome appears to be transdiagnostic, and not just for mental health, but also physical health. And I think it's similar to exercise. There are so many benefits to it, and maybe they are just small in different categories, but
absolutely. And like one of the things we're really excited about trying to understand the role of the microbiome in right now is in the area of comorbidities of depression, anxiety with things like irritable bowel syndrome. So we have a German PhD student who's working on this with my colleague Jared Clark, Lars Wilmes, who's really trying to understand the relative contribution of the microbiome to some of the functional, which is the pain processes, versus the psychological processes at play in relation to irritable bowel syndrome. So that's something that we really are. And the same with obesity and metabolic comorbidities. And I think that, you know, there's lots of transdiagnostic effects that we can really tailor this strategies to. And while a lot of focus in medicine over the last 30 to 40 years has been on genes and trying to understand the genomic aspects of all diseases. The problem with genetics is there's not a lot you can do except blame your parents or your grandparents. With your microbes, you can potentially modify them. And so that gives patients and people agency potentially over their own healthcare.
Yeah, that's an important aspect. I'm becoming a psychotherapist in CBT. So I'm, in the end, always interested in mental health. And I was wondering if you think that for some patients, the microbiome might really be the root cause of their problems, for depression or anxiety, for example. Or do you think it's probably, in the end, always more about alleviating some of the symptoms they're experiencing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I really do think that for some people, it could have been at the root cause, but it doesn't mean that you need to separate that from the root solution. So we know, for example, that like early life trauma is a root cause for many disorders, but you don't treat it by looking at trauma per se. You know, you can treat it by other ways, through psychotherapy or through other medication approaches. So just because the microbiome might have been what's gone wrong, it mightn't be the way to solve it, because we know during early life there's a lot of plasticity going on, and these changes that are driven by the microbiome, they may start come back together, but it may have led to a susceptibility. And I'm particularly interested in this in adolescence right now. So during the teenage years, there's a lot of synaptic pruning going on. There's a lot of biological processes that are really important. And we are exploring how the microbiome is shaping them. And then even if the microbiome comes back together, you know, these changes have already occurred, giving rise to susceptibility that might be unmasked through stress or other ways later on. So it's kind of a long answer to your question, but I think both are possible, you know, and then we can use the microbiome, and we have, to reverse changes driven by other factors in early life as well. Everything is connected, and if we can remember that the microbes were there first, we start to understand that everything is connected.
Yeah. I was also wondering, I sometimes speak to patients who say something like, well, they're depressed or anxious, but they don't really know why. And I was thinking maybe because if they say, well, like, I don't know, I have stress at work or school or a bad marriage or something that really seems to be outside of the body, so to speak. But if they are like, I have no idea why I feel that way, would you say that these, the subgroup might be especially promising to target with
I think it's a great question, and I think, you know, this goes back to the old classification of endogenous type of depression and what's driving it, and like, I'm very, like, one of our recent research grants has been trying to look at stratification of depression into different subtypes, and really looking at the relationship that anhedonic depression, that's really severe, not able to feel pleasure, not knowing why, atypical driven, often resistant to treatment. You know, I would love to see if that's driven by what's going on in the microbiome and whether we can target it in some way. It's hard to know right now. Again, I think we need to do that level of stratification, and that stratification both at a psychological and biological point of view. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay, so then it probably hasn't also been looked at, for example, the subgroup of depressed people with a lack of appetite, because in depression, for the people who don't know, there are some possible symptoms, but not everyone has to have all symptoms or these kind of symptoms. And then I was thinking also that those with the lack of appetite, maybe they have also something, you know, something in the gut.
Yeah, no, it's you know, a lot of the hormones involved are interlinked and can be regulated by the microbiome in appetite. But a lot of appetite regulation is also driven centrally through you know, dopamine pathways in the brain. So it's about, you know, targeting that. So it's plausible, and we need a lot more work.
Yeah, okay. That's the bottom line for this. I also heard you say in the podcast that the positive effects of exercising might be mediated through the microbiome. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's something that, again, that we're studying in Cork. We're trying to understand. So people know that aerobic exercise has been shown to have positive effects on the microbiome. We know that aerobic exercise is particularly good for modulating depression. Could these be linked? And that's something that we're trying to explore. And so there's been a lot more data now really focusing on exercise microbiome interactions. And so we're doing some studies where we're looking at this indeed, and looking at biomarkers to see, you know, of the psychological benefits of exercise, and to see if they're correlated with changes in the microbiome as well.
Okay, interesting. Like I said or showed, I read the book, and I was wondering, I mean, it's been 5 years now. It came out in 2017, I think. And you alluded to the sad fact that there hasn't been as much progress as you would have liked, or not much, or not enough funding, for example. But is there still some like key major findings that you would say a revised edition of 2022 would definitely include? Or are there maybe even parts where you say, well, that was wrong, or this was exaggerated, maybe we would have to cut this out or something?
No, I think, you know, the field has moved on a good bit. The evidence for it in the role of the microbiome in depression has got more complex, but more exciting in some ways. So 2 years ago, there was a large study from Belgium, which looked at over 1,000 people. and was able to show that those with a depression diagnosis had a very different microbiome, and they were missing some microbes, and they were present, and they validated that in 1,000 people in Holland as well. And then they also went into a group of very depressed, resistant, hospitalized patients in KU Leuven Hospital, and they were able to show that as well. So that was kind of a good paper to kind of like, you know, really back up what we were doing. And what they were able to do is one step further was identify that there were certain, it wasn't just the bacteria, but it's what they're making that was really important, and that they had the ability to make certain neurotransmitters or neuroactive agents that might be at a place. So that's really been exciting. Last year then that was followed up by a study from China, another large scale study, which really showed that there were certain microbes, again, linked to depression. This was really important. And then in the last week, a paper came out in Nature Genetics, again, linking depression to certain microbes again. So we're beginning to see that there's something here. There's really something. That's one thing. The other thing is that in a paper, big paper that came out in JAMA Psychiatry a few months ago, showed that there was a transdiagnostic depletion of certain bacteria that make short chain fatty acids across a variety of different mental health conditions. So that lacking butyrate producing bacteria in particular and so that was a big paper, again, implicating, you know, causally that the microbiome could be playing a role in general. So they're among some of the biggest things. In our own work, we really are interested in the role of the microbiome in the social brain and in the context, and so we've examined this more across the animal kingdom. So that has been really important, finding where we start to see that if you whether you're a bumblebee or a baboon, if you start messing with your microbiome, it interferes with your social behavior. And so that's really important. So we've ongoing programs in the area of social anxiety disorder, and other social aspects, and that to me is quite important. And then finally, the paper that got a lot of attention from us last year was even on the Steve Colbert show in the US, was a study where we had shown a number of years earlier that the microbiome in aging animals was changed. We showed Marcus Boehm, a very talented German postdoc in our group from Vienna. He went and showed that if we targeted the microbiome in middle age, I was very interested in middle age for obvious reasons, and that we could do this with inulin, that it reversed some of the effects of aging on brain inflammation. But then in the study Marcus did last year was where we took the microbes from young animals and gave it to elderly, really old animals. And what we did was we rejuvenated the brain. The brain was much, in terms of its chemistry, in terms of its neuroinflammation, and in terms of behavior, it behaved much better. And this has been replicated now twice, once by just a couple of months ago by the group of Marco Prinz in Freiburg in Germany, and then more recently from a group in the UK. So we're beginning to see that the link between aging and the microbiome is really important. And so some of this was in the book, but not to the same extent overall.
That sounds exciting, especially with the aging part. I haven't heard about this yet. And I'm also glad that you collaborate with so many Germans. That's nice too.
Yeah, well, you know, so my team is very big. My team is over 50 people. You know, we have a large team, so we have people from all over the world. Yeah. But you know, we always have had for many years now had a strong German contingent in the lab. And it's been really important, and really, you know, as we move, one of our big goals now is since the book came out also is moving into human research much more. So I always have a psychologist and a dietitian in my team now to help move this forward, as well as a psychiatrist. So
yeah, that's exciting. I have a weird question. Sometimes I'm feeling like a happiness flash, like really like ticklish almost in my gut, and I could really pinpoint where it is. And I've never had this before, and it started like 1 year ago. So, and it's special kinds of happiness feelings. I think it's always about excitement about the future, and then somewhere here it like tickles, and I know it's a feeling of happiness. I can't describe it else. And then something similar when I watch cute babies. For example, I watched cute babies approaching the camera in a video. I was feeling similar feelings, but like here in the teeth area. And I don't know, I mean, the teeth area isn't probably your expertise, but in the gut area, I thought maybe you could explain what this is, or yeah.
It's probably vagal dependent, and vagus is one of what we have cranial nerves that are really important in innervating and sensing all of our of what we do. And so the vagus nerve is one of these. There will be others that will innervate the mouth, but the vagus nerve is really important part of signaling from the gut to the brain, and it goes all the way into the part of the brain that can synapse up to the rewarding and happiness inducing places.
But have you heard this before? Because I've never heard. Yeah, okay.
No, to be honest, no. But you know, it's not within the you know, it's not
clinical range.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not suffering. Okay, great. So I always ask two questions, two personal questions, and then we are finished. So the first one is, what are your 3 favorite hobbies?
My 3 favorite hobbies would be. It's a great question, actually. Well, it's probably it's probably a film. Really boring ones. Film, reading, and just walking with my son. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, it stands to reason that or films and reading books being boring just means that many people do it, and there's a reason to it. So, okay. So the last question is, what career and or life advice would you give to someone who just graduated high school?
Okay. I would, don't burn bridges. Look at you can achieve many things. So don't pocket yourself too early. Don't, which is probably not good for the German education system, which you do that. But don't you know, try and keep as many options open as possible as you go on. You can be good at many things, and don't try and overthink it. You know, way will lead on to way, and you will find the right way.
Yeah, I think you were referring to, for example, we don't have like this undergraduate thing where you study all kinds of things. We really have to commit on our first day what we are studying in the bachelor degree. Yeah. And it's funny, my first episode was with Carl Fürsten, and he said his advice was keep your options open. And I think this is reinforcing this. Okay, so yeah.
We all could go down different paths. I mean, if someone had told me, you know, when I was in high school 30 years ago that I would be working on microbes in, you know, Cork, you could never predict these things. But it's really about keeping options and doing things that will, you know, really bring you get your imagination going and really get joy in terms of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Okay, so thank you so much for taking your time. And yeah, I'm really interested in this field, and maybe I will see more and more psychologists teaming up with you. That will be great.
It would be great. It would be great.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John Cryan, and I briefly wanted to explain 2 concepts which we kind of touched upon, but didn't really drop the terms. So one is multiphonality, which means that one thing can cause multiple or have multiple effects, multiple ends, so to speak. And this was when we talked about the transdiagnostic quality of the microbiome. So trans meaning across, and then diagnostic meaning across diagnoses. So the microbiome seems to be influencing many different diagnoses, and this is a very important concept in well, whenever you talk about the causal structure of something, because it's normal that it influences many different things and not just one thing. And the other concept that I think is very useful in general and not just for talking about the microbiome is equifinality. It's kind of the opposite, so that you have multiple things or paths towards one end. So it's similar to the saying of all or many paths lead to Rome. So if you take depression, which we were talking about, the microbiome might be one of the at least root or influential causes towards depression, but it's definitely not the only one, I think. And it's very important to have this idea of equifinality in mind, because depending on how you got to your depression, for example, the treatment or intervention should target this kind of root or these roots. It's obviously more complex than just one root or one path to depression, but it's still important to have in mind that one thing like depression, one diagnosis can be influenced or caused by many different paths. And that's equifinality, and you can use both multifinality and equifinality in all kinds of situations and causal structures that you come across each day. So yeah, just a little comment on how this, and actually I think how this will be coming up in probably in almost all podcasts that I'll be having here. So whenever we talk about how humans work, it's always about, in a way, causal structures and thinking about what caused what. And equifinality and multifinality are very important concepts in this regard. So I hope this was a helpful explanation in the end. And like I said, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please subscribe and like if you want. And then I'll see you again in one of the next ones. Bye-bye.